Making bread from scratch isn't just a job for the Amish. It's a deeply rooted tradition. While most of us simply throw ingredients into a machine, press a button, and wait for results, the Amish take a much slower, quieter, and profoundly soulful approach. They rely on the basic strength of their hands, a few simple tools, and a lot of patience to bring bread to life. It all starts with the essentials, gathering the right ingredients. While that might sound straightforward, there's a twist. Unlike many of us who buy flour at the nearest store, Amish families often grind their own grains or get flour straight from nearby farms. Imagine knowing exactly where every part of your bread came from, all the way back to the wheat stalk. It's a next-level farm-to-table experience that makes you question the supermarket loaf wrapped in plastic. For the Amish, sourcing ingredients is almost an art form and a commitment to quality that feels more like a philosophy. Using local ingredients isn't just for taste, it's about building relationships. Amish farmers don't operate like chain stores, they operate on trust, not paperwork. They might get flour from a mill nearby, eggs from a neighbor's hens, or honey from a cousin's beehives. It's a supply chain any business executive would admire, but with no emails or spreadsheets involved. These relationships go beyond transactions. They're personal. When your flour comes from a friend down the road, you're not just baking bread, you're honoring their hard work too. Of course, there are challenges. Harvests aren't always ideal, and sometimes crops don't cooperate. I've heard of Amish families adapting to shortages by using different grains or stretching ingredients to make things last, much like how our grandparents made do during lean times. Those breads, made with creativity and resilience, often taste the best, reminding us that good things come from perseverance. I once tried using old flour for baking, and the brick-like result was a solid lesson in the importance of freshness. The Amish also prioritize organic farming, long before it was popular. No synthetic chemicals, no shortcuts, just traditional crop rotation and composting. It's a slower process that takes more effort, but it preserves the soil for future generations. Bread made with grains grown this way has a distinct flavor, much like a juicy tomato from the garden compared to a bland one from the store. Not all Amish bread is plain, either. Some families add a bit of honey or molasses for special occasions, giving the bread a rich, warm sweetness. Just a spoonful can turn an ordinary loaf into something truly special, a treat worth savoring. I remember sneaking an extra slice at an Amish friend's home, thinking no one would notice, until I got a knowing look from his grandmother. When bread is that good, it's worth the risk. Once the ingredients are collected, the real work starts. No electric mixers or high-tech gadgets, just a bowl, a spoon, and hands skilled at working dough. There's something deeply satisfying about adding flour, yeast, salt, and water to a bowl and stirring it together. At first, it's easy, but as the dough thickens, it becomes a real workout, almost like wrestling a stubborn child. The Amish, however, embrace this process. There's a rhythm to hand mixing, a quiet dance only the dough understands, where you scoop, stir, fold, and repeat. This kind of work makes you slow down and appreciate the simplicity of the moment. Hand-mixing dough also teaches patience. The dough doesn't come together instantly. Dry spots linger, making you wonder if you need more water. But adding too much leads to a sticky mess that'll cling to your hands. The secret is letting the dough tell you what it needs. If it's too dry, just add a touch of water. Too sticky, sprinkle a bit more flour. It's almost meditative, like a silent conversation with the ingredients, and each time you listen, the dough comes together a bit more smoothly. I remember one of my early attempts at mixing dough by hand. Frustrated, I threw everything into a stand mixer thinking, what's the harm? The mixer whirred, and flour erupted from the bowl like a volcano. Standing there, covered in flour, I realized I'd broken the first rule of traditional bread making: respect the process. So I cleaned up and started over by hand, feeling more humble and more determined. There's a unique satisfaction in making bread the way it's been done for centuries, with no shortcuts. Plus, mixing dough is a decent arm workout. No need for a gym when you're baking. But hand mixing isn't just about the result. It's about the connection. You feel the texture change as you stir, smell the yeast as it activates, and notice how the dough starts to pull away from the bowl's edges. It's an experience that reminds you of the magic in simplicity. When the dough reaches that perfect texture, it transforms bread making from a simple task to a truly satisfying experience, showing how even the simplest actions can be rewarding. Our channel promotes only one product, a book by Claude Davis, a seasoned prepper. His book details 126 superfoods and preservation techniques that date back to challenging times, like the Great Depression and wartime. These time-tested techniques and high-nutrition foods are nearly impossible to find elsewhere. We chose to share his book because our generation is one of the last able to pass down these invaluable skills and foods to our children or grandchildren. Losing this knowledge on nutritious foods and preservation methods for crisis survival would be a loss for future generations. You can also find Nicole Apelian's book on herbal remedies in their store. If you're watching this on TV, look up our channel, Frugal Solutions, on your phone or tablet. In our channel description or in any video description, there's a link that will take you directly to these books. When was the last time stirring something made you feel a sense of accomplishment? Mixing dough forces you to stay in the present. Rushing it won't go unnoticed by the dough, which will remind you later with a disappointing rise or a dense, brick-like texture. But kneading, that's where the real effort begins. Once the ingredients are mixed, it's time to put your muscle into it. No stand mixers here, just you, the dough, and the table. At first, the dough feels sticky, almost defiant, as if testing your patience. But that's part of the process. Kneading isn't just folding and pressing, it's about determination. You stretch, fold, turn, and repeat, until the dough finally relaxes and starts to transform under your hands. Somewhere between the first push and the 100th, it becomes soft and elastic. If you're new to kneading, fair warning, it feels like a workout. After my first loaf, I was sure my forearms would go on strike, but the satisfaction afterward was absolutely worth it. For the Amish, kneading is a practiced art. Their hands move in a rhythm honed over years of experience, like musicians rehearsing scales. Watching an Amish baker knead dough is mesmerizing. They know exactly when to fold, how much pressure to apply, and they do it all without timers or recipes, relying solely on intuition. You can tell the dough is ready when it springs back slightly after a gentle poke, like it's giving you a doughy high five. Not sure if it's perfect yet. One way to test is to gently stretch a piece until it's thin enough to form a transparent window without tearing. This window pane test is a sure sign you've nailed it, though it often feels more like magic than science. Kneading isn't just about technique, it's also therapeutic. There's a calming rhythm to the motion, almost like a form of meditation. Some people spend money on stress balls or yoga retreats, but all you need is a ball of dough. 10 minutes in, any worries or stress fade into the background, leaving just you and the repetitive, peaceful rhythm. I once read that bakers tend to live longer than the average person, and after spending time kneading dough, I understand why. It's like free therapy that rewards you with a delicious result. What could be better? And while the Amish take their bread making seriously, they don't do it without a bit of humor. One Amish man told me that kneading dough feels like wrestling a very polite bear. It pushes back a little, but if you stick with it, it eventually gives in. And he wasn't wrong. Dough does seem to have a mind of its own, especially on humid days when it stubbornly resists cooperation. Trying to knead on a hot summer day, that's like grappling with a damp sponge. But at least the prize at the end is worth it. Occasionally, you'll see an Amish family turn kneading into a team activity. It's common for kids to join in, pressing their little hands into the dough with all the focus of a seasoned baker. Their results might be a bit lumpy or uneven, but no one minds. It's all part of the charm. Bread that looks homemade, imperfections and all, carries a warmth that makes it taste even better than anything you could buy. Kneading dough by hand may sound old-fashioned in our age of bread machines and electric mixers, but it's incredibly rewarding. It connects you to generations past, to the way people used to make bread long before electricity. By kneading, you're part of a tradition that spans centuries. It's humbling to think about. I like to joke that if bread kneading were an Olympic event, the Amish would sweep the gold, and they'd probably bake a loaf for the silver and bronze winners just because they could. After all that kneading, the dough finally gets to rest, and you do too. For the Amish, this rising step is more than just a break. It's a lesson in patience and trust. You've done your part. Now it's up to nature. Finding the right spot for rising is crucial. Amish bakers often cover their dough with a cloth and nestle it somewhere warm and draft-free, almost like putting a baby down for a nap. You hope it rises peacefully, but sometimes things go unpredictably. Temperature is a big factor here. Without modern thermostats, the Amish rely on instinct. Too cool, and the dough sulks, refusing to rise. Too warm, and it speeds up like it's in a race. I once left dough to rise on a windowsill, hoping the sunshine would help things along. A few hours later, I came back to find it had doubled, and then some. It looked ready to escape the bowl. I had to deflate it to keep it from spilling over the counter. There's an odd satisfaction in punching down a puffed-up dough. It's like popping bubble wrap, but with a purpose. The rising process is key for flavor, too. When yeast starts working, it's not just creating air bubbles, it's adding layers of subtle taste that make homemade bread stand leagues apart from store-bought. Some bakers even let their dough rise overnight, allowing it to ferment slightly for a more complex, almost tangy flavor. Bread has its own personality. It needs time to mature, like aged cheese or a good story. And waiting for the dough to rise teaches a lot about patience. If you rush it, you'll end up with a dense, sad loaf that even the ducks might pass on. The Amish don't just sit around waiting, though. While the dough rises, they find ways to use the time, maybe churning butter, sweeping the porch, or sharing stories over coffee. It's not just about passing time. It's about recognizing that good things come to those who wait, and when you finally uncover that dough after a good rise, it's magical. What started as a rough, sticky mess transforms into a smooth, airy ball, almost like it's been meditating. After the dough reaches perfection, it's time to shape the loaves. This is where the dough's personality really shines, whether it becomes a simple loaf, a soft roll, or an intricate braid for a special occasion. A good stretch and fold here gives it the strength to hold up in the oven. If rising was about patience, shaping is where you get to be creative. Now for the fun part, shaping the dough. After all that waiting, it's ready to become what it was meant to be. Whether that's a rustic loaf, a dinner roll, or even a braided masterpiece. There's something so satisfying about scooping it out of the bowl, still warm and pliable, and molding it into its final form. Some Amish bakers treat shaping as an art. Everyday loaves might be simple rounds, but for special occasions they create beautiful braided breads with 3, 5, or even 6 strands. I tried braiding once, and it looked more like abstract art than a loaf of bread. But even the most lopsided loaf has its charm. So, there you have it, the story of a loaf, from humble ingredients to a warm, inviting piece of bread. In every step, there's a blend of patience, humor, and tradition that make the whole process feel like much more than just baking. In Amish communities, baking bread is more than just about the taste. It's about tradition and symbolism. Certain bread shapes hold special meaning. A braided loaf, for example, might be seen at a wedding or a church gathering, representing unity and strength. Smaller, perfectly rounded rolls are often served at Sunday suppers, one for each person and maybe an extra for the family dog waiting under the table. There's a real pride in crafting something beautiful, even if it's just going to be enjoyed over a single meal. If the dough stretches awkwardly or tears a bit, it only adds to its charm. Like people, bread doesn't have to be perfect to be appreciated. But don't be fooled by the simplicity. Shaping dough takes some effort. Folding, tucking, and pinching edges tightly requires a firm but gentle touch. It's like trying to guide a toddler who just doesn't want to sit still. One moment the dough cooperates, and the next it sticks everywhere. Push too hard, and it flattens out. Go too easy, and it sags. Some Amish bakers even say that shaping dough builds character. Good bread needs a bit of struggle. The goal is to create a surface that's tight and smooth, giving the dough the structure to hold its shape in the oven. I learned this lesson myself when I tried shaping dough casually, just flopping it into a pan and hoping for the best. What came out looked more like a deflated football than a loaf. That's when I understood that shaping isn't just about appearances. It's about giving the dough direction, like a parent gently urging a kid to sit up for a family photo. Some Amish bakers even give the dough a good slap on the counter for luck. Not that they'd ever admit it's anything more than technique. Turning dough into rolls or pretzels isn't just about feeding a family. It's a rhythm passed down through generations. Kids watch their parents work the dough, sneaking tiny pieces to play with and sometimes getting scolded if they poke holes in a perfectly shaped loaf. Those little moments stick with you, like flour on your hands. Once the dough is shaped and has rested, it's time for the final step: baking. For the Amish, baking isn't about following the settings on a fancy electric oven. It's a skill that relies on intuition, experience, and a bit of trial and error. Many Amish homes still use wood-fired or brick ovens, each with its own quirks. These traditional ovens don't come with digital thermostats, so bakers rely on tests like sprinkling a bit of flour on the stone. If it turns golden within a few seconds, the oven is ready. If it burns too fast, it's time to wait. Baking in a wood-fired oven is an experience. The fire has to be started hours in advance to allow the oven to reach the right temperature. In the summer, this turns the kitchen into a sauna. But once the fire's going, there's no turning back. You'll see bakers adjusting logs, tweaking the airflow, and occasionally waving away smoke like they're orchestrating flames. I once tried baking in a wood oven myself, thinking it would be a quaint experience. Instead, I ended up frantically fanning the smoke alarm while my loaf turned rock hard. Clearly, some things are best left to those with experience. Temperature control in these ovens is a skill handed down through generations. Some Amish bakers can tell if an oven's ready by feeling the air inside for just a second. They'll stick a hand in briefly, long enough to gauge the heat without getting singed. Ask them how they know, and they'll simply say, "You just know." It's an instinct that develops over years, like knowing exactly how long to steep your tea. What's fascinating is that each oven has its own quirks. Some run hotter on one side, some cool down faster, and a few seem to have moods, easygoing one day, temperamental the next. But this unpredictability is part of the charm. It's not about achieving perfection. It's about embracing the journey. The Amish believe that bread reflects the baker's state of mind. If you're calm and focused, the bread will turn out beautifully. If you're distracted, it might come out a little wonky, just to keep you humble. And the aroma that fills the house when baking in a wood-fired oven is irresistible. It lingers in every corner, clinging to your clothes and hanging in the air long after the bread's been pulled out. I once tried to sneak a slice before it had fully cooled, but the bread wasn't ready to cooperate, crumbling under my knife. Lesson learned: patience isn't just a suggestion when it comes to good bread. For the Amish, traditional baking is about respecting the process. There's no rushing, no cutting corners. The bread will be ready when it's ready, and the journey is just as satisfying as the final result. When the loaves are finally in the oven, the most challenging part begins, knowing the exact moment to take them out. Any baker knows that it's not as simple as just setting a timer and hoping for the best. The Amish have a different approach to timing, one that's more like a dance, a rhythm developed through years of practice rather than relying on a clock. You could try to measure the minutes, but bread doesn't conform to a rigid schedule. It follows its own rhythm, and getting it just right requires being present, watching, sniffing the air, and listening. The first clue comes from the smell. As the bread bakes, the aroma gradually shifts from a yeasty scent to something warm and nutty, filling the air with an irresistible fragrance. I'll admit, I've often hovered near the oven, waiting for that specific moment when the smell changes, convinced that maybe, just maybe, it's ready. Of course, my impatience has led to more than a few loaves with pale crusts and gooey centers. Mastering timing, it seems, is still something I'm learning. The Amish use a few simple but reliable tricks. One is the color of the crust. It should be a rich, deep golden brown, almost on the verge of being too dark. If the crust looks too pale, it needs more time. If it's too dark, well, you might have just made some extra crispy toast. Another method is to tap the bottom of the loaf. If it sounds hollow, it's done. If not, it goes back into the oven. And yes, that means flipping hot bread with bare hands. Not for the faint-hearted. A good baker knows that sometimes a little courage is required in the kitchen. Another common mistake is opening the oven door too soon. It's tempting to take a quick peek, just to check, but that sudden drop in temperature can cause the bread to deflate faster than a balloon. It's like watching a suspenseful movie and skipping to the twist before you're supposed to. Patience in baking, I've found, is rewarded with perfection, or at the very least, with a loaf that hasn't collapsed. And timing can change with the seasons, adding both charm and challenge to traditional baking. A loaf that needs 30 minutes in winter might be done in 25 minutes in summer. Some say it's the kitchen temperature, others swear it's the humidity. An Amish friend of mine once joked that bread has a mind of its own and doesn't like being rushed. "It's like kids," she said. "Give it the space to rise or it'll rebel." Experienced bakers develop an instinct for timing that seems almost mystical. They can tell a loaf is done just by noticing the way the crust starts to pull slightly from the edge of the pan, or the crackling sounds it makes as it cools. No timer, no thermometer, just the kind of knowledge that only comes from baking hundreds of loaves. Once, I asked an older Amish baker if she ever used a timer. She just smiled and said, "I trust my nose more than a clock." Hard to argue with that. Now comes the hardest part, waiting. The bread may look perfect, and the aroma might fill the house with an almost magical fragrance, but cutting into it too soon is a rookie mistake. The Amish know better than to rush this step because bread needs time to settle. If you've ever tried slicing a loaf fresh from the oven, you know how it goes. What should be neat slices fall apart into a pile of steam and crumbs. That's the bread's way of saying, "Not yet, friend." Traditionally, the bread is placed on wire racks to cool, allowing air to circulate around it and keep the crust nice and crisp. Skipping this step means the moisture trapped inside will seep out, making that beautiful crust soft and soggy. It's like ironing a shirt and then tossing it in a pile. It defeats the purpose. Some say the Amish take this step so seriously that they'll leave a loaf to cool for an entire day before slicing. I haven't managed that level of patience, but they might be onto something. Cooling isn't just about preventing crumbling. It also allows the flavors to develop fully. As the loaf cools, the ingredients, flour, water, yeast, settle and blend, creating a harmonious flavor. Slice it too soon, and the flavors aren't quite ready, like a song cut off halfway through. I once tried to cheat the system by sneaking a slice while the bread was still hot. I grabbed a knife, eager to enjoy a fresh piece with some butter, only to watch it crumble. The butter melted into a sad puddle, steam escaped in a huff, and I was left with more of a bread disaster than a snack. Lesson learned. Good bread is worth waiting for. And don't worry, the loaf won't disappear while it cools. That is, unless you've got kids around, in which case, all bets are off. Some folks think cooling is just science, but it's also a kind of ritual. There's something peaceful about that in-between time when the bread is done baking but not yet ready to eat. It's like waiting for tea to steep or listening to the rain. In Amish kitchens, this is often a time for stories, finishing up chores, or a quiet moment of reflection. The bread doesn't just require patience. It invites you to be present. And speaking of presence, here's a small tip from an Amish baker. If you tap the bottom of a cooled loaf and it still sounds hollow, you've done it right. It's a simple test, but there's a certain satisfaction in that hollow knock, like the bread is giving you a nod of approval. Once cooled, the bread is finally ready for slicing. But here's another lesson I learned the hard way. Never use a dull knife. I once tried cutting a fresh loaf with an old blunt knife, and the bread fought back. A sharp knife is essential if you want clean, even slices. After waiting for the bread to cool, you'll want those slices to look as good as they taste. Now that the bread is ready, the only thing left to do is share it and savor it with those you love.